Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles. The series of books and videos on American history is seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Ulysses Grant, and the focus is Vagabond Years. The year is 1848. Grant's been away for a couple of years, spending a chunk of that time in Mexico in the recent Mexican War, but that is over. He is now back, and he has one thing on his mind, and that is his fiancée, Julia Dent. He not only wants to see her, he wants to marry her, and so he hustles off to St. Louis, and sure enough, that August they exchanged their vows. He's 26 years old, and one of the people standing next to him was James Longstreet, one of his groomsmen, future general in the Confederate Army. Not standing by him in the Dent household on that day were his parents. Jesse and Hannah Grant decided not to come to the wedding. They couldn't see themselves socializing with the Dent family, and the topic of divide was slavery. Jesse Grant, an abolitionist from the early days, the Dent family unapologetically pro-slavery. They were not going to mix. So the wedding took place at the Dent home in St. Louis, and then Julia and Ulysses went off to visit with his parents in Ohio. Well, over the next 12 years, Grant would spend about half that time in the military and about half that time in civilian life, and most of it was disappointing. We'll start with his first assignment, which actually was in Detroit, but that didn't last long. As the quartermaster in the 4th Inventory, he was then assigned to Sackett's Harbor. This was in New York. Bitterly cold winter. He wasn't very happy. Julia was not happy at all. She's pregnant with their first child. Decided to send her back to the Dent family near St. Louis to have the first baby. They named him after her father, Fred. But Grant had other responsibilities coming as well. And this was going to be another trip, was going to be away from Julia. The California Gold Rush was underway, and more soldiers were needed on the West Coast. And so in 1852, Grant was assigned to Fort Vancouver. Julia wasn't going for a couple of reasons. Number one, she was pregnant again. Number two, this was a dangerous journey. There weren't a lot of ways to go from the East Coast to the West, and most of them were pretty perilous. And the one that this expedition chose was to go through Panama. Now, the problem at the time was there was no Panama Canal. That wouldn't come for decades. But it was a shorter distance, and so this was a common way to transit from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The problem was multifactorial. First of all, the transportation was terrible. Combination of canoes, a little bit of a railroad, you've got some carts and wagons, a lot of walking, terrible scorching heat, torrential downpours, so the weather was a big problem, but none of that compared to the disease, cholera, which went rampant through this party. Grant was fortunate. He didn't drink the local water, so he actually was spared from the disease, but not so many of his traveling companions. In fact, 700 would leave, 250 would perish on the way, including all 20 children who were on this trip. Now, Grant did the best that he could. As one of his fellow officers said, Grant took a personal interest in each sick man. He was a man of iron so far as endurance went, seldom sleeping, and then only 2 or 3 hours at a time. He was like a ministering angel to us all. Well, it was a hellish experience in Panama to somewhat of a divine experience for Grant when he finally got to the West Coast, because he fell in love with San Francisco. In fact, he spent about a month in that area and enjoyed the entire time, much more so than when he headed north to go to Fort Vancouver, in the Portland area from today. And again, Grant was bored. This brought him back to his days on the frontier when he first graduated from West Point. There just wasn't a lot for him to do, and he really missed Julia and the kids, now plural, not only young Fred, but also young Ulysses, who they would call Buck. He expressed this mortification of being isolated to Julia in a letter when he said, "You do not know how forsaken I feel here. I do nothing here but sit in my room and read and occasionally take a short ride on one of the public horses." He also chided Julia because he was so lonely. He craved her letters, and she didn't write very many. He wrote a lot more than she did. It just sort of wasn't her thing, but it just sort of contributed to the melancholy that Grant was going through at the time. Well, he then tried to do whatever he could to sort of get in the spirit of the California Gold Rush and try to make a buck. And everything he tried basically failed. He did some speculation on land. He also procured a bunch of provisions to try to sell those in the San Francisco market. That didn't go very well. Bought an interest in a partnership in a general store in San Francisco. Again, nothing seemed to work. Others were getting rich. Certainly not Ulysses Grant on the West Coast. He then also started drinking. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about Grant. He was a drunk. This has to have some context. In fact, Grant rarely drank. The problem was when he did drink, he couldn't handle his liquor. As one fellow officer said, one glass would show on him and 2 or 3 would make him stupid. This was his problem. He was a lightweight, in part because he was so light of weight. He was 5'6", 125 pounds. He's a rather small individual. And so when he did drink, he did not do well. He didn't drink very often, but it definitely stood out when he did. Well, one of those times that he did got him in trouble. He was transferred to Fort Humboldt in the northern part of California, again, even more remote than Fort Vancouver. He was unhappy, he was lonely. By the way, this is 1854, and a lot of his former colleagues at West Point are leaving the military. They had put in their 10 years or so, they had fought in the war, prospects may be better elsewhere, so a number of them were leaving. So Grant then brought all this together in an incident where his commanding officer, Robert Buchanan, found him inebriated on duty. And he basically gave Grant a choice: face the charges or resign. And so Grant resigned right there on the spot. Now, some were very upset with Grant for this, including his father. Jesse was not happy at all. He tried to convince him to change his mind, and Grant said no. The fact is that the military was never really in Grant's plans from the beginning. That was his father's idea as a means to get an education, and Grant really didn't enjoy himself, especially, frankly, during peacetime, where he had very little to do, and more than anything else, he missed his family. He wanted to be back home with Julie and the kids, so that's what he did. He was thrilled for that reunion. And pretty soon had another child on the way. A daughter, Nellie, was going to be coming into the family. All of this was fine, except he had to pick a career. He had to figure out what he was going to do now that he put the military behind him. And so he said, I'd try to be a farmer. And he built a farm, a house, a home on a farm that they called Hardscrabble, kind of an apt name for it. They only stayed there for a few months, though, because their situation changed when Julia's mother passed away. So the Grants decided to move in with Julia's father, and he worked his farm. This was a tough time in the country. It's 1857. Economic panic actually settled in across the country. Prices were falling, farms were failing, including Grant's. So he's really trying to figure out what to do. And one of the things he could do was make a quick buck. And he refused to do so in these circumstances. Now, as we talked about before, Frederick Dent was pro-slavery, and he had slaves. And he gifted to Ulysses Grant one of his slaves by the name of William Jones. Well, again, Grant had been raised by an abolitionist. This was anathema to his father. It was anathema to him. And he not only didn't want to hold on to a slave, William Jones probably could have caught about $1,000 on the open market, money that he could really have used. That was immoral to him as well. He simply went down to the courthouse and set William Jones free. So then the family moved to St. Louis, because that's where the St. Louis city proper, where Frederick Dent's other home was, to see if maybe the Grant could find some work there. And in fact, Dent set him up with a couple of jobs, one in real estate. That didn't work out, lasted about 4 months. Then he tried a job at the St. Louis Custom House. That was less than 1 month before he quit. So he finally did something that frankly he never thought he would do, and that was go back to his own father, Jesse. Now, Jesse Grant had been really successful in the tanning business, but it was a business that Grant had told his father early on, I don't want to be in this business. Well, now maybe changing his mind. Part of the business of Jesse Grant was a store, a leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, and it was being run by Grant's brothers, Simpson and Orville. But Simpson had just been diagnosed with tuberculosis and really wasn't up to working in the store. And so Grant offered to take his spot. And originally his father kind of balked at this. Again, they had had a bit of a rub about whether or not Grant would join the family business. He said no. His father respected that. Now, I wasn't sure he wanted to welcome him in, but they worked it out. They moved to Galena, got a house, and Grant actually contributed quite a bit to the productive nature of this store. Pretty calm period, actually, for Grant at a time that was hardly calm for the United States. This is the latter portion of the 1850s. The country had gone through, or has been going through, really the last decade, turmoil, particularly in the plains in the area of Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had been passed under President Franklin Pierce a few years before. This set a stampede of Northerners and Southerners to try to make a homestead in Kansas so they could use the popular sovereignty provision to try to make Kansas either pro-slavery or anti-slavery. Ended up being a very violent period. James Buchanan comes in as president. He can't do much to quell this. Political factions are dividing along sectional lines. So 1860, this is going to be a big election. there's a new party called the Republicans, or really a sectional party. They had run a candidate first in 1856, and now they're much more serious and strongly aligned around no more expansion of slavery. That was their national platform, and they put Abraham Lincoln forward as their candidate in 1860. The Democrats split. Along North and South, they had two conventions to try to get a single candidate. They couldn't do it. By fracturing, they basically handed the election to the Republicans, and Lincoln was going to become president. The South had threatened that they would leave the Union if a Republican became president of the United States, and once the election was done, that basically started to happen. States began to kick in and say, I'm going to secede, beginning with South Carolina in December of 1864. There were different thoughts about secession. Was it constitutional? Was it not? We've covered in previous episodes the feelings of different presidents on this, and there were different sides. Well, Ulysses Grant wrote about this in his memoirs, and he had kind of an interesting take. According to Grant, the problem changed on the ratification of the Constitution by all the colonies. It changed still more when amendments were added, and if the right of any one state to withdraw continued to exist at all after the ratification of the Constitution, it certainly ceased on the formation of new states. It would have been ingratitude and injustice of the most flagrant sort for this state to withdraw from the Union after all that had been spent and done to introduce her. Secession was illogical as well as impractical. It was revolution. It's sort of an evolutionary theory of secession on where it stood from a constitutional standpoint from Ulysses Grant. Well, in the meantime, Lincoln becomes inaugurated as the 16th president. All eyes focused on Charleston, South Carolina. In the harbor there were Fort Sumter, sort of the last bastion of federal military hold in the South. Lincoln decides to reprovision the fort. The Confederates had surrounded it. They decide to attack. Civil War is underway. Well, Lincoln called for volunteers, 75,000 troops, and a lot of Grant's former colleagues at West Point were coming back into the military, thinking this was an opportunity for them to serve their country, take on a leadership position. What about Grant? Well, he attended a rally in Galena, Illinois, which was very much pro-Union, pro-soldiers, pro-Civil War in terms of supporting the Union side and Lincoln, and Grant was moved. He decided at that meeting that he would sign up again. He told his brother Orville in leaving the meeting, I thought I was done with soldiering. I never expected to be in the military again, but I was educated by the government, and if my knowledge and experience can be of any service, I think I ought to offer them. So he did, and he committed with pride in a letter he sent to his father, who often said that Grant maybe didn't have strong opinions on things, kind of like he did. Well, he had some strong opinions in this note when he said, whatever may have been my political opinions before, I have but one sentiment now. That is, we have a government and laws and a flag, and they must all be sustained. There are two parties now, traitors and patriots, and I want hereafter to be ranked with the latter. Actually a pretty strong statement for the usually very understated Ulysses Grant. Well, the question now was, what role would he have? How would he contribute to the Union effort? That was a little unclear at this moment, which makes it a story for another day. That is Ulysses Grant and the Vagabond Years from the life of Ulysses Grant. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books from Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.